Hello and welcome to another two-part review. So today I'm going to be looking at some rather budget, shall we say, whiskies from Lidl supermarket here in the UK. Probably available from Lidl wherever you are in the world where you actually have Lidls. As before, I'm going to present these two videos as separate videos, but with a little bit of a head-to-head comparison at the end of the second video. So you can watch both parts or just the part that you want, whatever you want, up to you. So we're going to be comparing Queen Margot 3-year-old blended Scotch whisky and another Lidl product, Glenorchy blended malt Scotch whisky. So they seem to be fairly similar products. They're both 40%. They're both almost certainly chill filtered and unnaturally coloured. They're both reasonably young whiskies. The Queen Margot blended Scotch is 3 years old, so that's the legal bare minimum in terms of age. The Glenorchy blended malt is 5 years old, so it's brilliant that even though these are young whiskies, Lidl have chosen to tell us exactly how old they are. Whether that's an effort on behalf of Lidl to give some more transparency into the whisky industry, or if they think that at this price point people are impressed that it's 3 years old, maybe not even aware that that is the legal bare minimum. It's hard to say, but it's good that we've got that information. But where the similarities do end between these two products is that the Queen Margot, which is slightly cheaper than the Glenorchy, is a blended Scotch whisky, whereas the Glenorchy is a blended malt. So what that means is that the cheaper of these two products, the Queen Margot, is a vatting of at least one single malt whisky, and probably not too much because it's expensive, and at least one single grain whisky. And from the price point of this whisky, and because it tends to be the way that blended Scotch whisky is, we can probably assume that probably the vast majority of what's in here is probably grain whisky. Whereas with the Glenorchy, because it's a blended malt, that means that this is at least two single malts and nothing else. There's not going to be any grain whisky in here, so it should be a high quality product. So I'm going to start with the Queen Margot blended Scotch. So let's put the Glenorchy out of the way for now, and let's pour some of the Queen Margot and see what we've got. Doesn't really matter for this price point, but both products do come with screw tops as well, which you probably expect. So I mentioned that these are probably unnaturally coloured whiskies, bearing in mind that this is 3 years old, and I don't expect that there's been any premium sherry casks go into this vatting. From the colour, it looks suspiciously copper tinted. Almost certainly quite a bit of E150A spirit caramel got into that. But let's try not to let that prejudice us. Will also say, anyone that's interested, if you read the back of the label of the Queen Margot, it does actually give away that it's produced by the Clydesdale Whisky Company, which those of you that are in the know will recognise as basically White and Mackay. So here we go, Queen Margot 3-year-old blended Scotch whisky. There's no way to put this politely. It's not a pretty smelling whiskey. I think my suspicion is that because of the price point of this whiskey and the fact that it's blended Scotch, that I was assuming that it's going to be mostly grain whiskey. I think that's exactly on the mark. It smells like cheap, rough, immature, not particularly well made grain whiskey. It's spirity, it's got strong notes of acetone, rubbing alcohol, really is a bit harsh. I think the only thing that you can really say that it's got going for it is that although it is very spirity and harsh, it's also relatively mild as well. It's not actually that much smell to it at all. You really have to get, for a start, if you weren't drinking this in a proper nosing glass, if you had it in a tumbler with ice, you probably wouldn't get much aroma at all, and that's possibly the intention. But what you do get is really just spirity, harsh, young, immature. You are getting a little bit of coconut in there, a little bit of vanilla, slight chalkiness. So you're getting basically what you'd expect from a young grain whisky that's been stuffed into probably a second or third fill bourbon cask, just so that it's a box ticking exercise really, that they're sticking it in a fairly inactive cask for 3 years so they can say that it's old enough to sell as Scotch whisky. It's sad. I'd love to say that this is going to be an absolute bargain and you should go and get some, but I really think that that's what's happened here. So let's see how it tastes. Not sure if I want to do this, but for science. Again, it's actually really weak. There's not much flavour there at all, which probably makes it seem a little bit worse than it is. Because it's so mild, all you've really got there is a little bit of coconut coming from those casks and a little hint of caramel. Whether that caramel is coming from the bourbon casks or you're actually tasting the spirit caramel possibly. You've got to remember that spirit caramel is really nothing like what you think of when you're talking about caramel in sweets or the stuff that you might buy in a squeezy bottle. Spirit caramel is essentially burnt sugar, completely charred sugar to the point where it only exists as a colorant. And if you taste spirit caramel, which is a really bad idea, it actually doesn't have much sweetness at all. It's mainly just burnt and bitter. But because there's so little going on in this whiskey, I think you probably can taste, and it's quite a prominent feature of this whiskey, you probably can taste that spirit caramel, which is a bit unusual to say the least. Other than the faint vanilla caramel notes, you're really just left with those weak, harsh and spirity notes, pretty similar to what we had on the nose. As for the finish, again, it's a really short finish. This is a really, really mild whiskey, and all you've really got on the finish is a lingering sense of sort of neutral grain spirit. You really could be mistaken if you had this in a blind tasting. I could see some people identifying this wrongly as a cheap caramel vodka, or possibly just a very young grain whiskey, which the majority of this probably is. So, honest verdict on the Queen Margot 3-year-old, it is vile shit. It is vile shit, and you shouldn't buy it. I'd actually say that I'd put this down there in famous gross territory. As for a grade, I think I'm going to give this, I'm tempted to not give it a grade at all, but I'm going to give it an E. It's really hard to say anything particularly positive about this, other than perhaps that if you used it as a mixer and you didn't put too much in, it might be fairly inoffensive. Possibly. Me personally, I actually kind of regret buying this one. I haven't got through much of this bottle, and I honestly don't really know what I'm going to do with it other than possibly gift it to someone. So I think we'll put this one aside and just pretend that I never bought that. That probably sounds like a good idea. So that was fun, wasn't it? Be sure to join me in the second part of this 2-part review when we're going to be looking at Lidl's Glenorchy 5-year-old blended malt. Hopefully that'll be a bit better.